When I was a kid, growing up near Philadelphia, my family used to spend part of the summer on the coast of Maine. While we were up there, my dad would sometimes take me on trips in a little dinghy around the many islands off the coast. My brother wasn't born yet, and my mother preferred to stay on land, so it was just the two of us motoring around. When we arrived at a new island, we'd pull the dinghy up onto the sand on the island's little beach, then walk inland, exploring among the rocks, the ferns, and the pine trees. Often, at some point during the expedition, my dad's demeanor would suddenly change. He'd turn to me with an earnest, keen-eyed expression and say, "Do you hear that distinctive call, Ken?" Invariably, there would have been absolutely no audible animal sound provoking this question. What would follow was a description of a completely imaginary animal and its habits, which were invariably ridiculous. "Do you hear that distinctive call, Ken? That's the flapping blue clacker bird. Now it's time to tell you about the yellow peep grunt. I don't have to tell you what its call sounds like, but if you do hear it, watch out." I would enter into the spirit of these imaginary nature tours by asking him earnest and sometimes anxious questions about the traits and behaviors of the imaginary animal under discussion. We would explore whole islands like this. He, the imaginary mentor, I, the imaginary protege, both of us surrounded by the real world, as well as by the imaginary one we spun into existence as we explored. About 15 years later, after I graduated from college, my family took a trip to California. At one point during the trip, my dad and I once again found ourselves exploring an island, Catalina Island, once again just off the coast, though a different coast. As it happened, Mom and my brother, now in his mid-teens, were back at the hotel, resting, so it was, again, just the two of us. Catalina is a large, hilly island, and eventually my dad and I reached the top of one of the higher hills, surrounded by the scrubby plants and red earth of a western climate at high elevation. As we walked, I noticed that in the dirt of the dusty trail ahead of us had been traced a sinuous line. When I pointed it out to my dad, he stopped, looked pensive, and said, "That's the distinctive track of the Quetzalcoatl serpent." I immediately fell into my role. "What does it mean?" I asked. "It means," he said, "when we get back to the wagon train, we'd best break out the rifles and ammunition and be ready to defend ourselves." Then he leaned in confidentially. "But we should do it surreptitiously. We don't want to frighten the women." During this same trip through California, Dad and I read a science fiction book by John Crowley called Engine Summer. We took turns reading it, passing it back and forth between us like candy. It takes place far in the future, long after civilization has collapsed. Unlike many stories of this kind, the humans that have survived don't live a harsh, warlike life, but rather coexist peacefully in small communities. These far future people don't perceive their predecessors from before the collapse as ordinary humans. With all the technology and power they had, they must have been something more. So these future inheritors of the earth call their ancestors angels, and call the remnants of the past civilization, which litter the landscape, angel artifacts, angel machinery, angel roads, angel architecture. Since these future humans have lost the ability to recreate these artifacts and only partially understand their original purpose, all they can do is look on the remnants with wonderment and awe, and sometimes sheer bafflement. As Dad and I finished the book, the notion of angel remnants passed right into the family's private language. From then on, whenever anyone encountered a mysterious building or machine or object, one of us would say, "Ah, this was built by the angels." The first time this happened was when we were still in California. Driving toward Yosemite Park, we passed through the Altamont Wind Farm, a huge area of rolling hills capped by thousands of wind turbines. No one in our family had seen such a landscape live before. When we first drove around one of the rolling hills in the area and saw row upon row of the things whirling like giant pinwheels, I immediately exclaimed, "Angel architecture." Now it's 15 years later. As many years beyond California as California was beyond those island trips in Maine. Mom died several years ago, and my brother, now a grown man, lives on the West Coast himself. I've lived in Buffalo for the last 8 years, writing and teaching. Recently, Dad came to visit me, and together we went down to explore the industrial area along the waterfront. Soon after we began our wandering, one or the other of us realized we were surrounded by the wreckage of angel machinery. We imagined a far future of our own on a depopulated Earth, the majority of whose population, or perhaps a privileged minority, had fled to the stars long ago. We imagined the remaining population wandering among the remains, gazing at the machinery in wonderment, speculating about the function and circumstances of these artifacts, projecting their own ideas and dreams onto them, creating hypothetical stories, imaginary memories about them. Later in our walk, we imagined an expedition returning from space, wandering through the empty landscape left behind by those left behind by the angels. Those in the expedition would understand the machinery and its function, but would now be trying to reconstruct the meaning of its destruction and ruin. Neglect brought about by ignorance? Rage at abandonment by the angels? Or just a desire to forget the angels and move on in time? At one point, much as we'd encountered the sinuous track of the mythical Quetzalcoatl serpent in the sand, now we spotted our own footprints in the dirt. We had a good laugh imagining two nervous explorers jumping at the prospect of encountering someone and flying momentarily into a panic at the sight of their own footprints, spinning out all manner of stories, imagining who those who left the footprints might be. Do you hear that distinctive sound? Angel architecture.
you.